Hello, I'm Prescott Fire Chief Holger Durre, and I'm here today with a very special topic. As you've probably seen in the news media, we are refocusing our efforts on wildfire risk management. And I have a very special guest today, Conrad Jackson, who has been hired as our new wildfire risk manager. Welcome, Conrad.
Thanks, Chief. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Hey, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your history here, as well as what attracted you to this role?
So I'm a longtime resident of Prescott. Moved here as a child, '79, so I've been here for a few years. Over the course of the time as an adult, an employed adult, I worked for the Forest Service for about 8 years. At the same time, I was a high school teacher at PHS,
Wow.
so summer job, winter job kind of thing. And then I switched over in 2001, became a firefighter for Prescott Fire. Served 20 years Prescott Fire, was on the hazmat team, was on the wildland team, retired in 21, and had 2 years off. I went back to working for the Forest Service again, worked out at the tanker base. And then I heard that the city of Prescott was making a new position. And several individuals from the department reached out to me and said, "Hey, Conrad, you know, this position kind of sounds like you." And so that's why I did follow it up with you, you know, and met up with you to see what really you were shaping up. And it was kind of interesting because while it was something that you had in mind, you hadn't firmed up all exactly what it was. So it was kind of a work in progress where you also wanted that individual that you hired to make the thing that we were going to have for our final product.
Yeah.
And so all of that appealed to me. It has an educational component, which is obviously as a trained school teacher it appealed to me. The wildland aspect, 30 years of wildland firefighting for me now. So I've got the breadth of knowledge in wildland, and it's a position that dramatically affects the community that I live in and have lived in the vast majority of my life. So it's near and dear to my heart. So it was a good fit.
You know, you articulated basically all of the reasons why you rose to the top in the selection process. There was no doubt that you were a good fit for the position because of your background. But the other thing that I want to highlight here for folks is, you know, one of the things that makes this department so special is that we are tradition-based, we're family-based, we're tight-knit community serving our community. And having you come back, so to speak, and serve in this role is just an extension of that culture. And so for me personally, it's really great to see you back. I'm personally grateful as a fire chief that you took us up on that challenge because it's not an easy role. It is a new position. And speaking of that, let's shift a little bit to that wildfire background. You've been here in the region for a really long time. We have some significant wildfire risks, but we also have tremendous opportunity. We have probably the best cooperation between state, federal, and local partners anywhere in the country. We have so many people that are invested in the community here, in those partnerships as well. We have support from our council and our elected officials, and that doesn't stop at this dais, that goes all across the elected officials that are here in the region. However, that wildfire risk is constant and it remains. Why don't we just frame that a little bit for the viewers so that they have an understanding when we say, you know, we live in a high wildfire risk area. We don't want folks just to get scared by that, but we also want them to have an objective understanding of what that means. So can you frame that a little bit for us?
The wildfire risk for Prescott,
Right.
It's significant. It's been so for a long time. We live in one of the largest contiguous forests of stands of ponderosa pine. So that's a lot of fuel in and of itself, and it's been suppressed for a long time because we've been living in the community. We've been suppressing fires as soon as they happen, and it's allowed what we call like a fuel debt. So more and more brush, more and more trees, because we haven't been thinning it out. We haven't been. It hasn't had the seasonal fires that it would experience in a natural ecosystem. And now we, as the community, as people find our community, they're starting to build out more and more into it. And so we actually have two different issues from my perspective as the wildfire risk guy. One is we do have those homes that are extending out into the forest. And people see that risk very easily. They perceive it, they're like, oh, they live in the forest, they're in high risk, they're ponderosa, you know, they're living in the pondos and stuff like that. And that's absolutely true. So that is a risk, but the other component to it is we have an old community. My neighborhood over by Taylor Hicks, built in the 80s. So all of the brush, all of the plant life in those interior neighborhoods within the city of Prescott have all filled in and grown and matured and stuff like that. So you find folks that because they live in smack dab in the middle of the town, they're like, oh, the wildland risk isn't for me, it's for those folks that live out, you know, out by Groom Creek or out Ponderosa Park. They're living on the periphery of town. They're both at risk. And ironically enough, the vast majority of homes that got destroyed over the last, say, 10 years or so weren't in either of those type of fuel types. They were in grassland fires, as well you're acquainted, having come from Colorado. So really all the fuel types that are present here in Prescott are all risk factors, and they've all grown thicker over time. And we didn't even start engaging the Wildland Urban Interface Code until '06. So we're kind of behind the curve as far as getting caught up with how do we mitigate all of these fuels. And so the big trumpet that everybody has blown for the last almost 2 decades now has been Firewise. And so we talk about Firewise, what used to be POWIC, Prescott Area Wildland Urban Interface, is now Yavapai Firewise. But the message is the same, and it's about individual homeowners coming in and mitigating the risks around their home. And it comes in zones, usually perceived as like the first 10 feet of no vegetation, and then 30 feet out, broken vegetation, no ladder fuels on the ground, and then out to 100 foot, still broken and removing ladder fuels, removing any dead branches and other fuel types like that. And the idea with that is to help, if there is a fire rushing into your neighborhood, that you reduce its intensity and you get it back to being a ground fire instead of a crown fire. And so that message is well known in the community, but it is just an individual homeowner's control. And of late, the later message we've been trying to develop is the fire adapted community message. And that's more of a holistic approach where we recognize that business owners should care about the wildfire risk. So like if you're a business owner here in town, if you took out, say, just, if we had a massive wildfire that destroyed a part of the forest here and it impacted, say, the Whiskey 50 and the Whiskey Row Marathon, if you took out those two things, you would cut out $200 million out of income into the basin. And specifically, the city's budget would lose $6 million. So as a business owner, you should probably care about wildfire prevention. That should be a part of your deal. So we need to start thinking like a community about the risk that our whole community is in, because it's not about your house or my house. Although it is kind of cool if you Firewise your house, it's one of the few natural disaster mitigations that you can do that actually improves the survivability of your neighbor. Where if you live in Oklahoma and you put in a tornado shelter underneath your home, that's going to protect your family. It's not going to protect the neighborhood. And by the same token, hurricanes, you put up sandbags around your house, you're protecting your house, but it's not doing a favor to your neighbor. Whereas wildfire mitigation, if you're doing fuels mitigation, you Firewise your property, you're making things better for everybody. So we need more folks to dive into that concept where like, oh, we're in this together. Because we don't want to be a Lahaina. We don't want to be Paradise City. We don't want to be Boulder. These are places that lost significant amount of property. In some cases, 94 lives, something like that in Lahaina. We don't want to experience that there. And as a longtime community member, I don't want to see my community that I love destroyed in that fashion. So that's an aspect of your expectation for me for this job, is that I try to make us think more like a community as opposed to a single homeowner.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think getting back to that risk too, the Forest Service, like I said, is very engaged here. And one of the things they did nationwide is do a fire shed assessment. And in that fire shed assessment, the Prescott Basin rose right up to the top because of a lot of the factors you brought up: the fuel model, the fuel type, the topography, the adjacency of our values at risk to that fuel type and fuel modeling. And because of that, one of the things that has resulted of that is we've gotten $73 million of infrastructure funding to our U.S. Forest Service here. And to put that in context for people, the budget of the Prescott National Forest is around $10 to $12 million a year. And they've gotten an influx now because of that fireshed assessment. And the reason why I want to bring that up is you touched in what you just said a couple of times on, well, okay, so the realization is here that we have this issue. You spoke about fire-adapted communities, and you spoke about, well, what do we do about it? And I just want to maybe break that out a little bit further into saying, yes, absolutely, the community doesn't only need to see its broad impact, for instance, like on the business community, it's also how can the business community impact the problem? How can regulatory agencies properly impact the problem? Because to me, one of the other things that we need to start talking about is in the normal traditional experience around wildfire, we think about suppression. Of course, in this community, we are extremely closely connected to wildfire suppression. However, we also need to understand that we can never build a fire department big enough that we can put in front of a wildfire impinging town and say 100% of the time we can assure that we're able to protect all property and all lives. It is just not possible.
It's not realistic.
And the issues that you brought up, wind-driven fires in Boulder and Lahaina, those are just two of those examples. And you mentioned fuel types. It's not just in the Ponderosa, it's in those, fuel types that are literally throughout the entire community. As a matter of fact, if you're in Yavapai County, you are impacted by a wildfire. It's not just even the city of Prescott. So the reason why I bring all that up is because we have to start talking about mitigation. We have to start talking about response, like we always have. But we also have to think about recovery as part of a fire-adapted community approach. So it's not just the, I wish it'll never happen, it's the eventuality that when it does, we're able to help the community get back on their feet, because we have seen in Paradise and all those other examples that you listed that really it is not realistic to say it'll never happen here. As a matter of fact, fire is a natural part of our landscape. We just saw our really good efforts, speaking of that infrastructure funding, of our prescribed burning that the Forest Service just did this fall. That's just a part of that infrastructure funding. But where I'm going with this is let's talk about strategy. You've mentioned that there's a lot of things that we both mutually envisioned with this role. And one of the things that we've talked about is we really want to get into a 3 to 5 year mitigation strategy that isn't just driven by Prescott Fire, but that is an engagement by Prescott Fire as a facilitator in a fire-adapted community conversation. So when you talk about how do we address this fuel debt that you mentioned, what are some strategy things that are in your head of the conversation we're going to be driving?
So there's a couple components to that. One is the actual citizens of Prescott, but the other side of it is us and our cooperators, which you brought up. And ironically enough, this particular week, we're having the hazard fuel mitigation meeting, and that's where we take all the key players, the Forest Service, Yavapai County, State Land, BLM, ourselves, other cooperators, fire cooperators in the region, and we put us all into, I'll call it a war room, is we look at the big picture for Yavapai County, and we look at what has been done, what already is on the books, where have we checkerboarded out and failed to mitigate this particular area or that particular area to help develop what you're talking about, those long-term plans as far as what do we want to be working on 3 years from now, what do we want to work on 5 years from now. We also, and the whole time, recognizing that these are plants. They're going to grow back. So what's our initial implementation? What's the maintenance plan look like to maintain that? And so we look for opportunities wherever possible to join projects in to create a unified fuel break, because it doesn't do a whole lot of good if the Forest Service is working on their side of the fence over on this end of town, and our forestry crew with the city comes and works on an area over here. It's more effective, obviously, if we're unifying our efforts. And that's part of the reason we're having the big war room meeting, and we do that twice a year. So we all sit down and we come up with a plan on what's this thing going to look like. And so you mentioned something earlier about working with your cooperators, and I've got to tell a story. People don't realize what we have with our automatic aid agreements. So we all have jurisdictions, we all have these areas that we're supposed to work, but we have agreements that are called automatic aid understandings between us that we all recognize the risk, and wherever the thing is, whatever that thing is, be it somebody having a heart attack, a car wreck, a wildland fire, whoever's closest is going to go and start dealing with that. That doesn't happen everywhere. And I didn't realize what I had here in our community until I went someplace else. And I had a Prescott Fire engine off on an off-district assignment in Southern California. We had been fighting multiple wildland fires, and there was a day with no fire. They parked us at a ranger station. And like 4 lanes of highway over, 10 o'clock in the morning, at a park on a hill, a fire started. And I turned to my crew, I said, hey, get your yellows on. Right? And the Forest Service guys that are there, like, what are you doing? I'm like, there's a fire. And they're like, no, that's, at the time, they're on, that's on CDF. It's CAL FIRE now, but yeah. And I'm like, yeah, so? And they're like, it's their fire, it's not ours. I'm like, you gotta be kidding me, we can do that right now. And I'm watching the thing, it's starting to get bigger and bigger. I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. And they're like, they said, they'll call when they're ready to pick up the hose. And so we sat there for like 4 hours, and sure enough, CDF finally showed up, started laying out hose, and they chased this thing up over the top of the mountain. And like they said, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we got the phone call, come on over and help us with this fire. And it's a horrible way of doing business. Yeah. So I'm so happy that I live in a community where we all get it together, and we're supporting each other, and we're doing the most appropriate actions in a proactive fashion to protect our community. Yeah. I had no idea how good it is here until I went someplace else.
Yeah, and the bureaucracy can't stand in the way, right, of the risk that we face. You know, you mentioned that. I saw the same thing here during the Crooks Fire, when everybody just came together seamlessly. And we had things established here in the first 12 to 24 hours of that fire that sometimes take a week to get taken care of in other communities. And it is in part due to those relationships. And the nice thing is, when we're talking about mitigation, and we're talking about, you know, response, and we're talking about recovery, those relationships are there as well. It's the automaticity, to use that word, of the understanding that we will be there for one another, whether you're a federal partner, a state partner, or a local partner. And that's something that does make us extremely special. I think it is something we need to highlight more often for our residents, because really it is what makes this work.